Hello, fellow music nerds, and welcome to the Music Makers and Soul Shakers podcast. I'm your host, Steve Dawson, coming to you from the Hen House Studio in Nashville, Tennessee. Each week, we'll bring you a new episode that'll feature conversations with artists, producers, and people involved in making great music. I've been making records and playing live music for about 25 years, and in that time, I've had the chance to meet and work with some phenomenal musicians and technicians. These interviews are often the result of those meetings, whether on stage at a festival or show, or from working in the studio. In some cases, these will be interviews with complete strangers, but they all have one thing in common. Each one of them has had a significant contribution in making what I consider to be innovative and original music. Join me each week as I bring you conversations with a wide range of guests and hear their fascinating stories and philosophies on art, life, and music. Reach us on Facebook or the web at www.stevedawson.ca. And make sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Let's get down to it. Hey there, fellow music nerds. Welcome to episode number 8 of the Music Makers and Soul Shakers podcast. I am your host and creator of said podcast, Steve Dawson. I'm coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. I'm thrilled to be bringing you these weekly interviews with various luminaries from the music world, and this week we have a great one. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who takes the time to listen to these episodes and people that write in and comment on iTunes or email or wherever you pick these podcasts up. It does mean a lot to hear from you, so please keep that up. I'd love for you to spread the word and share these around as much as you can. In the long run, I think the more I can get these podcasts and interviews out there, the more it'll make it possible for me to keep them coming in. I'd also like to mention at this point that we have a donation link up at the top of each episode at stevedawson.ca. Just head over to the website, go to the podcast page, and there's a little blurb about each episode, and there's a donate button there. If you feel so inclined to contribute, donations go towards the costs associated with equipment, hosting, and promotion of the show. I create these episodes with the help of my pal Jeremy Holmes, and it's done out of the love of music alone, but we would be grateful for any donations you'd be willing to make if you're enjoying them and would like to see them continue into the future. In other upcoming news, I'll be performing in Nashville this Thursday, May the 5th, at the Basement. It's a full band show. It's an album release show for my new album called Solid States and Loose Ends. And after that, I'll be heading up north to Canada for a series of shows around Ontario. I'm playing in Toronto and Ottawa and a few small towns, Hamilton as well, and around there. Then Montreal and Newfoundland. That'll all be in mid-May, so please check the website as well, stevedawson.ca, for all of those dates. And now on to the important stuff. Today is my interview with the mighty Marc Ribot. If you're listening to this episode, I assume you probably know who Marc is, but if not, you're in for a real treat. Marc is a guitarist and composer, and he came out of the late 70s, early 80s New York scene with a really unique sound and approach to guitar that's made him one of the most in-demand session guitarists around, as well as live performer, soundtrack scorer, band leader, and more. I gotta say, I went into this interview intimidated as hell. For starters, as much as I'm familiar with the music of the people I interview, I like to do some real research, and kind of overwhelmingly got the feeling that Marc doesn't really like to be interviewed. I think he probably finds it annoying and doesn't really hold back with those feelings sometimes. He's cut some interviews short that I've read and seen, and he definitely has no patience for uninformed interviewers. Plus, there's just something really intimidating about those heavy-hitting New York players who've seen it all and been around forever. And not knowing Marc, which I don't, never met him, never spoken with him before, so this was sort of out of the blue that he agreed to be on the show. So with him not knowing me too, I went into this a little nervous, and things started off with him being, a little short maybe, and not knowing where this was all leading. But I think he really warmed up to me after not too long, and things started to roll along really well, and he told some great stories, and this turned into a really, really cool conversation. So I'm excited to bring this episode to you. Yeah, it's a kind of a cool arc here where he really opens up and talks about all kinds of great stuff from his early days, getting his career going, his influences, all through the Tom Waits stuff and the Lounge Lizard stuff, his solo career, sessions with T-Bone Burnett and Joe Henry. I think his comments about people misunderstanding Chuck Berry that you'll hear a little ways into the interview, it's so spot on and heavy that it'll make a lot of you go back and do some more Chuck Berry homework, I hope. Marc is a really busy guy. He's got a ton of dates coming up. He has an album coming out in June with his new band called the Young Philadelphians. He's got some West Coast dates in Vancouver and Seattle and Portland, I think, with his group Ceramic Dog. And that's in June. And then he'll be in Boston and New York City with his new band, the Young Philadelphians, in late July. So you can get info on all that stuff and lots more at his website, which is marcribot.com. His name is spelt Marcribot. All right, again, thanks for listening. Thanks for checking out the podcast. Please subscribe on iTunes and share it around as much as you can. Enough of my yapping. Let's go talk to Marc Ribot. You've developed a style and a way of playing that's totally unique, and you seem to be able to blend, you know, like Chuck Berry style riffs with more free and angular lines. You found a way to make that viable as a session player as well. And I'm wondering if it was a conscious decision to just stay true to developing your own style and not try to sound like anyone else.
Well, first of all, I'm not at all interested in this idea of branding or being original or having a style. I've tried to play what seemed appropriate in the bands I was playing in and in the music I was playing and what I liked. And beyond that, there's no method to it. The reason I started to play, the reason I played, in fact, rather than sounding like nobody else, I think I sound like everybody else. I think it's really important for musicians to be literate. I think anybody calling themselves a rock guitarist should know Chuck Berry's solos and not just a few cliches that everybody knows, but pay some attention to them. I'm quite a traditionalist. And I also had a lot of affection for Django Reinhardt's playing and Hubert Sumlin's and B.B. King's and Grant Green's and a lot of other people who are not guitarists. So, I spent a lot of time with them, and it influenced my playing. The reason I started playing, incorporating, let's say, maybe some elements of Webern or something into blues solos is because I was bored. I was bored of playing the way I'd been playing, and that seemed to make me less bored for a little while.
At the time that you're talking about, were you playing in fairly straight-ahead blues situations or something? What was it that you were finding was limiting?
Well, I had played in fairly straight-ahead blues situations. I'm using the word blues loosely, both,
right. Yeah.
Both tightly and loosely, I guess. I'd played in some blues bars and bands, but, never, I would never say an ongoing band, but just in the sense that 60s style guitar playing is blues-based.
Sure.
In a way that, punk styles kind of drew away from.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't think they drew away from it, by the way, because of any problematic with the blues per se. I think they drew away from it because of what had been done, what white guitarists quoting blues licks had come to mean.
Right. And you were also into the classical guitar thing too, right? I know you studied with Franz Casillas, and I'm just wondering what effect that had and what influence that had on the way that you played and the way that you learned chords and chord voicings and your harmonic approach to the instrument on electric guitar, I mean.
Yeah. Well, okay, it had a couple of effects. You see, I don't know that I was that into classical music per se. I mean, my studying with Franz Casellas was one of those things that I would have to call a really, really lucky accident. Franz was a friend of my family. My aunt was a songwriter. She wrote under the name Rhoda Roberts, but her name was Rhoda Unger. And she lived on the Upper West Side, and she and my uncle lived on the Upper West Side, and they became like personal friends with Franz. And so, when it was time for me to have guitar lessons, they just said, "Well, Franz needs students,"
So it was kind of a default.
Yeah, kind of a default, but it was extremely lucky default.
Right. What kind of things were you learning from him? Like, were you literally a beginner at that point, or were you already playing a certain way and learning a new thing with him?
No. When I started guitar lessons, from scratch with Franz, and we started on the way he was trained, I guess, Romance de Amor, Leyenda, or a simplified version of Leyenda. And so, in terms of what influence it had, well, it had several. One of which was that, I didn't learn to play with a pick until I was I started maybe when I was 24, 25.
Okay, so you were fingerstyle right up to there.
Yeah, I was fingerstyle, which what I did with Franz's stuff was, I played the pieces that I learned on classical guitar, but by the time I was 15, I was adapting that. I was playing in like garage bands in New Jersey. So, since I didn't know how to play it with a pick, I did it with my fingers. And this is actually, a perfectly respectable choice, except there's one problem. Like, if you play really hard like I do, you can pull off classical style depends on having some amount of fingernails on your right hand.
Yes.
And if you play really hard like I do, they're all broken to bits by by like midway through the first set. So, the way it was I could play really well for about half an hour. And then after that...
You're just a bleeding mess.
Well, the bleeding wasn't really the problem, but there was a lack of speed and clarity. So, what I did, that was a case of a limitation which forced an adaptation. So because of that, because I could never know whether I'd be, because my chops were so dependent on the vagaries of when a fingernail would break, I learned to play with a lot more economy. In other words, I always had to have a plan B, and my plan B was B.B. King. I had Plan B.B. Which is because B.B. King had such economy in his solos, was not, but it was clear from the beginning that I was not going to be the next Joe Pass.
Is that kind of what made you pick up the pick, is just realizing, like, I got to change my style enough to accommodate the kind of music I'm playing?
Yeah, I would say so. When I came to New York, I believed I was going to be a session player, and, I forget whose statement is it, we drive through history with our eyes in the rear view mirror. When I came to New York, that scene was just was not in its heyday, and was starting to break up already. The session freelance session gigs that were available were starting to be more. I mean, there was definitely an A team of people who were doing a lot of sessions in New York, but it started to shift more to commercials and stuff like that, and I just was never cut out for that world.
You wanted to make albums.
Well, to be honest with you, I just wanted to play guitar. I just didn't know, I didn't know exactly what I wanted. I just knew I wanted to play guitar and eat. Those things I was sure. Those were the only things I was sure of. That scene was very businesslike.
Right.
That's all I can say. And it helped to be into coke.
Got you through it.
Yeah.
And so you moved there from Newark, right? That's where you were brought up, and.
Well, that is where I was brought up. I was born in Newark and brought up in Orange, and then later South Orange.
Okay.
There was a little diversion. I had a unfortunate and mercifully short academic career lasting 1 year in Boston.
Really?
And then I moved up to Maine, and that was where I started working as a guitarist, just basically because there were no other jobs.
What was going on in Maine? Like what kind of stuff? What kind of stuff were you doing in Maine musically?
Well, that's a good question. Let's just say I didn't move there for musical reasons. But what I wound up doing there, first I got some gig at a pub where I was playing solo guitar, and then I got into a rock band based out of Rockland, Maine, which might seem like a very obvious place to start a rock band, but in fact wasn't. And so with that first band, I don't even remember what we did. We played stuff.
Are you still a teenager at this point?
Well, I was 19.
Okay.
Old enough to know better.
Sure.
19, 20.
Yeah.
I moved back to New York from Maine, I forget, 22, 23.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I was playing, we were playing in bands that played at bars, and we played rock and roll at bars. And I wound up in this band, where I think if we had been smart enough to know what the top 40 was, we would have been a top 40 band. But instead we just played, I don't know, it was a couple of guys who came from this band called Biggie Rat that had been stopped working when they were blacklisted after they and their members destroyed a club and left the hospital, left the club owner in the hospital with, quote, 38 human bite marks.
Oh my God. Now that's rock and roll, man.
Yeah, it was very rock and roll. So the band was half those guys, and then we had a lead singer, rhythm guitarist, this guy Scott Wetterow, who was amazing, and he came from he came up from Alabama, where he'd been doing some kind of show band where he wore platform heels and squirted milk out of a dildo, and you know what I mean?
Sounds like Zappa.
Anyways, so he was more. Anyways, there were many different musical tastes, and our lead singer was Kay. I remember she played the piccolo, and I remember doing, we would get these gigs. We got a gig up on the border of Holton, these places, Van Buren, Holton, these places way up on the Canadian border. And I remember playing behind this exotic dancer. And
sure, I did my share of that in Canada too.
Oh, you did it in Canada. Okay.
Well, I'm from Canada, and there was a whole circuit of those kind of places. Yeah.
Right, but then that if you're from Canada, maybe you can tell me if you perceive. But my thing is, when you go to what Americans think is the end of America, Canadians think of it as the beginning of America. And so when they come to America, that has to mean one thing: sex. So in these nothing towns up there, nothing but potatoes and logging roads, there would always be a couple of potato farmers who came across the border from Canada.
Yeah.
And anyway, some of them were sitting in this bar where we were playing, and I just remember, there was some poor abused woman there with the farmers throwing nickels at her, and she was taking off her clothes on the floor, and we were playing the hustle, and Kay was trying to
You're painting a very
piccolo
vivid portrait.
was going slightly cross-eyed, overblowing on the piccolo. Anyways, so let's flash forward to my fabulous career.
I love it. It sounds amazing.
Well, it's an interesting bookend with that. In the end, I got my revenge, because now we have this band, the Young Philadelphians, with Jamaluddin Tacuma and Calvin Weston, and the Young Philadelphians, and we do harmonic versions of classic Philadelphia soul tunes. So
there you go.
He who laughs last. Anyway.
Now you're playing the top 40 from 40 years ago.
Exactly.
Had you ever dipped your toe into any studio work at that point, or was that totally foreign to you still?
Well, my aunt, like I say, was a songwriter under the name Rhoda Robertson. When I was a teenager, she had brought my high school band into the studio to back up these singers that she was trying to get off the ground, and it was pretty much of a disaster.
Awesome.
But it was fun.
Yeah. Did you kind of get into that whole studio thing at that point, or was it later that you developed?
No, it was later.
Okay.
I went back to New Jersey, and we went back to playing bar mitzvahs.
Okay. So going back to the guitar thing, like at what point did you start picking up a pick and really trying to develop the physicality? Because you do play really hard. Anytime I've seen you, it's like, your right hand in particular is like really digging in, and I can imagine that would be hard on you at doing a full night. Was the pick thing...
Well, now I'm used to it. I mean, after all, it's been, 47 years, so I got used to it.
Right.
Yeah, I picked up a pick in my mid-20s, and by my late 20s, I was like, pretty much for electric playing, that's how I was doing it. But stylistically, I find that I still use... Like I'll play with a pick, but to do wide intervals, cross strings, I'll often play with my ring finger or middle finger, and I find I can get like interval leaps that would be difficult if it was just.
And you still do play fingerstyle sometimes, though, right? Like I saw you with Buddy Miller here at Third and Lindsley not too long ago, and I think you were doing some straight fingerstyle stuff. I could be wrong. I was a little far back.
No, that's right. That's right. Sometimes I
toss
play
the pick.
Finger picking style.
Yeah.
Either by putting the pick in my mouth or by playing with a mixture of fingers and pick. Although, just a word to the kids out there, you got to be careful about putting the pick in your mouth.
Don't swallow.
Don't inhale. Like Bill Clinton,
Yeah, exactly. So when you ended up moving to New York, this is like mid-70s, I guess, or something?
1977, 78.
Okay. Like, is that when you ran into John Lurie and that whole scene and got involved with the Lounge Lizards?
Not right away. When I first came to New York, I was trying to be a jazzer,
Right.
So I would go to these little jam sessions. And what being a jazzer has mostly meant, or what it mostly meant at the time, was like making a living playing club dates or something while playing really cheap jazz gigs, or club dates in New York, meaning weddings, bar mitzvahs, parties.
Yeah.
While going to a lot of jam sessions. That's what it meant at my level anyways. So, I mean, my ambition, that was my ambition. And like as far as it got, we're playing, with some really good local bebop-oriented players like Don Hahn, the trumpet player. I did like about 4 months with brother Jack McDuff.
were you also still playing like R&B stuff? Because I know you did side band stuff with like Wilson Pickett and Chuck Berry as well. Like, was that like...
Yeah. Like one of my first major bands, and well, my first, I guess my first real band in New York was this band called the Real Tones, Brenda and the Real Tones.
Uh-huh.
And the lead singer was this very dynamic and cool woman named Brenda Bergman, who I ran into just the other night. And it was the Real Tones, which later became the Uptown Horns band.
Mm-hmm.
And we fancied ourselves, kind of Stax Volt soul purists, but in fact we were kind of more like soul punk.
Okay.
But I'm
soul
anyone
via New York.
Well, soul via New York at the time.
At the time,
we were playing at Hurrahs and CBGBs, and but then what happened was we started to get called on to back up actual R&B singers.
Right, because a lot of those guys used to tour with no band, right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, Wilson Pickett was another story, but, we backed up Solomon Burke, and that was my first commercially released record, was Soul Alive, Solomon Burke and the Real Tones.
Will you just hold on to what you got? And let me tell you why. Cause if you think nobody wants her, just throw her away.
And were you touring with him, or was that like a one-off?
Well, the touring part was a one-off, but we used to do these week-long runs at Tramps, a club called Tramps, and those were terrific, fantastic.
Was that in New York, or was that elsewhere?
Yeah, a club in New York.
Okay.
It was an earlier location. Club later moved and then later closed.
Yeah.
But, it was near Union Square, and we did, we had those kind of engagements with Carla Thomas, Rufus Thomas, Syl Johnson.
Wow.
Solomon Burke, so
you guys kind of had
wonderful.
You guys kind of had the reputation of being the band to call for that kind of thing for artists coming through New York and touring regionally or whatever, I guess.
Exactly. And that's how I got to work with Chuck Berry too, is because, they called us, because they knew that if they called us, like sometimes I would do the horn arrangements or one of the horn players would do it, but they knew that if they called us, we would, and we had you see, it's so funny because how things have changed so much. Like at the time, if you wanted to be into that stuff, you had to know a record collector. Like all the bands who were really into that.
Right.
And this was true, I found out later, of like a lot of the British bands, that became so famous here, like Led Zeppelin and Cream and all that stuff. They all were serious archivists, record collectors. So you either had to be one or know one.
Yeah.
If you wanted to be into that kind of cool stuff then. You couldn't just go to a record store and say, oh, I'll take a 1958 Solomon Burke recording, please.
Right, right.
It didn't work that way. It just didn't work,
So who was your connection to all that stuff? Did you
Well, we knew this guy, Jonathan Greenfield, who is today married to Ronnie Spector, who's another singer.
Oh, no way.
Come to think of it, I backed up. Yes.
Okay.
And Jonathan, at the time, now he goes by his original name, but at the time he was known as Johnny Soulboy. And when he wasn't making, finding records by probably dubious means, he would, I once ran into him in Times Square, and he was one of those guys who had watches all up and down his arm.
Hey, buddy, want to buy a Solomon Burke record?
I'm afraid that was the story. So anyway, yeah, Johnny Soulboy.
Wow.
He kept us well supplied. If we got the gig, he would show up with the records, and I would put them on, and or with cassettes of the records or something, and we'd learn
bootleg versions probably, right?
Record collecting is a very consuming addiction.
Yeah, I'll say.
It's good to. I used to think it was good not to start off listening to records because it would lead to harder stuff.
Like 78 collecting.
Yeah. Man, that's the wet brain version.
That's you're in deep and nerdy when you get to that level. As a guitar player, how do you approach a gig playing with Chuck Berry? Like what, obviously he was a big a deal for you when you were growing up and learning probably, and he would probably, I would imagine, not want to be upstaged by anyone, so you have to be aware of that. Like how do you approach playing with a guy like that? Or were you just playing like rhythm guitar for Chuck?
Well, the way you approach that, the way I approached playing with Chuck Berry was the way a religious person would approach God.
Okay.
Because in my case, theologically, that's where I was at.
Uh-huh.
And the feeling, the expression, fear of God, a God-fearing person.
Yeah.
Well, you approach the deity with trembling.
Right.
And so what that word fear of God means is it's a certain amount of respect for the awesome power of what you are approaching.
Okay.
And so I had like a lot of trepidation because Chuck had a reputation for, if he didn't like the guitarists, he would, first showcase them, put them up in the front of the stage,
uh-huh.
and say, "Isn't he great? Now get the fuck out of here." So like
humiliating as well as like not really cutting it and probably getting fired.
I don't know. I had never seen it myself, but there was that reputation.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there was also a lot of asshole guitarists who, either would try to upstage Chuck Berry, who thought they could do that because they could play super fast,
right?
Or who thought, "Oh yeah, I know that Chuck Berry shit," and we're totally unaware that every tune was a different arrangement on guitar.
Yeah.
Every tune had an original approach on guitar.
Yeah.
And they knew half the solo to Johnny Be Good and thought they knew something.
Right. It just lumped it all together into one.
Yeah, and just lumped it all together into that stuff.
Yeah.
And Chuck Berry's playing, like I said at the beginning of this interview, if you're going to call yourself an electric guitarist, you should spend some time with those recordings.
What don't the music intrigue you when they gaily crowd? If you can't dance, I know you wish you could. I got my eyes on you, baby, 'cause you dance so good.
And for that matter, with Ike Turner, too.
Yeah.
You don't have to accept his advice or example
of life.
his advice on as a marriage counselor, but his fucking guitar playing is awesome.
Yeah, man. Who else were the big ones for you? Like aside from guys like were you into Muddy Waters and like some of the acoustic blues stuff as well, or were you more of an electric blues fan?
Hubert Sumlin was big, Howlin' Wolf was big, but I mean, I dug a lot of different people, Skip James stuff, Lightnin' Hopkins, I love.
Yeah, man.
My baby don't stand no fooling, my baby. My baby don't stand no fooling, my baby. My baby don't stand no fooling. When she hot, there's no cooling. My baby don't.
Jimmy Reed, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
But also, you know, like, need to say that I grew up as a teen. You know, I started listening to that stuff like later. You know,
Oh, yeah?
I mean, as a teenager, I listened to all the same rock bands as everybody else,
Okay.
which, you know, in the late 60s, early 70s, you know, was Hendrix,
Yeah.
Cream,
Yeah.
Eric, you know, whoever was around then, you know.
Did that stuff influence your playing? Like, I don't hear much of that stuff
Yeah,
in your...
of course. Well,
And-
you know, that's what I did when I was, like, in high school.
Right.
Well, actually, here's a funny thing, because that's what I did when I was in junior high school. But by the time I got into like high school, I got into this band with these older miscreants who had already graduated high school and were already in a retro band, and it was called the Milburn Grease Band.
Okay.
And like they used to hang out, like they worked night shift. Like I thought they were, you know, like I was in high school. And I thought that they were so unbelievably lucky because they worked the night shift
Right.
at this cab company, so they
Yeah.
could just hang out all night and listen to music, you know. and two of the guys who drove also the cabs were also really cool. Like one of the cab drivers was named Miles from Nowhere.
Really?
He was like a kind of maintaining junkie, and he would
Yeah.
sometimes get lost and he would call in and say, "Where am I?" You know, and the other guy was known as the Invisible Man because he was always slumped down so low in his car that everybody would think the Invisible Man was driving the car. Anyway,
Awesome.
no, so I was already in a retro band when I was in high school,
Uh-huh.
and
Playing 50s stuff.
yeah, playing 50s stuff.
Uh-huh.
Well, they played a weird mixture, and this was portentous for me because they played a weird mixture of we played a mixture of 50s doo-wop and rock and roll mixed with MC5 stuff.
Nice. That's a good mix.
Yeah. It's a real good mix.
Yeah.
You know, you'd have to sing Rockin' Robin and then some song about fighting the police. It was really inspiring.
So retro, but with a modern edge.
Well, yeah. I mean, you know, people don't realize, or maybe some people realize, you know, but that how much the punk movement was closely tied to a desire to return.
What do you mean by that?
To return to a kind of original energy.
Like-
And by the way, to this day, I have huge admiration for, you know, Wayne Kramer and Fred Sonic Smith, the MC5's
Yeah.
guitarists, and I find their recordings extremely inspiring.
They sure are. Yeah, they're fantastic.
Yeah.
So did you play a lot of that kind of stuff too? Like, were you, aside from that band that you were just talking about, were you playing in any other more punk-oriented bands at the time?
What happened with me is I came up more through like this, you know, the Real Tones, and then I got into Lounge Lizards.
How did
New
that come
York.
about? Was that just hanging out in New York? You ran into John Lurie, or what was the?
Well, not exactly. I was friends from the jazz thing with Roy Nathanson, who later went on to form with Curtis Folks the Jazz Passengers.
Right.
I knew Roy through a mutual friend I met at a jam session.
Uh-huh.
Roy introduced me to Lurie, and that's how I got in the band.
Okay.
Arto, they had fired Arto. You know, with these bands, it's interesting how a lot of them the No Wave bands went through a certain evolution in which they started off on this pure conceptual and punk energy.
Yeah. Which the Lounge Lizards definitely had.
Yeah, but especially in its first incarnation with Arto Lindsay. But at a certain point, people wanted to go beyond those parameters, to actually try out musical ideas, and they found that they needed musicians to do that. And so it was really lucky that I was in that place at that time, because I was a musician, but at the same time I was literate enough to understand why these people who I could understand why Arto Lindsay was cool, and I don't just mean because of the of the
pants
quote
he was
unquote
wearing.
style. Yeah,
Right.
I mean, I understood his guitar playing. Arto's guitar playing was a revelation to me, because there I was listening to all these jazz people.
Yeah.
And what Arto was doing sounded better than any guitarist that I was listening to.
In what way?
Well, its effect on me, And then
it's
I
hard to
I
describe
started to think, I started to listen, say, well, what Arto's doing, I was thinking, playing my bebop licks and thinking how to make them more out, and trying to imitate this or that saxophone copying out, transcribing Eric Dolphy solos and shit like that.
Yeah.
But then I thought, man, Arto's music feels more like Albert Ayler than anything that I'm doing with these fucking transcriptions.
Right. So there was a spirit there, an improvisational element that was new to you at that time, or you just hadn't?
Yeah, it was kind of new to me. I got introduced to all the other no wave stuff through being in the Lounge Lizards.
Mm-hmm. And were you was that nerve-wracking replacing him? I don't know if you'd consider it replacing.
Well, Arto had been out of the band already. There had been an interim year or something like that.
Did they go guitarless for a while?
For a while, they had a trombonist instead of a guitarist. For a while, they tried these other people who were John's friends, and said, well, you can play guitar. Sure, here's a guitar. Look, Arto did it, so you can do it.
It's easy.
They tried it that way for a while, but anyways.
And how much of a band was that band at the time? You devoted quite a bit of time to the Lounge Lizards, 5 or 6 years, right? Was it a full-time thing that you were constantly gigging and recording and stuff, or were you doing a lot of other stuff at the same time?
Well, people don't understand this about New York bands, okay? Very few New York bands are, let's all live in a big pink house and, eat granola together in the morning. And, New York bands is an abstraction. A band is a project, really.
Right.
Very few bands, at that level. So we were all doing other things.
Yeah.
We all had other gigs, other projects we do, and we get together to do tours. But the other thing is, it's like in New York, it's not like you can work every night.
Right, of course.
It's not somebody, in other words, it's not, hey man, come down and play for for a week at the local Hooters. It ain't that way. You know?
And was it kind of shitty money playing in the city as well? You had to go out of town to actually make half decent bread?
Well, I'll never know what the actual money was.
Okay, right. You were paid what you were paid.
Yeah, but I mean, we got paid okay.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. You couldn't live off doing the 1 or 2 gigs you could do in New York a month.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, but what it was what it was about, and what it's still about, is doing enough gigs to get going here, and then getting a real tour in Europe or Japan, and that's exactly what we did.
Right.
But our tours were not, we didn't tour 8 months a year it wasn't record based.
Right.
We were.
Yeah, you don't go out on a big promotion tour with that kind of band. You're just playing music, and there happens to be a record that comes out.
Yeah, that's kind of how it is. I mean, it was film based. I'll tell you, the Lounge Lizards got a big boost after Stranger Than Paradise.
Was Jim Jarmusch hanging out with you guys at the time? Like, he was sort of in that scene, right? Like, what was his role in that whole thing?
Sometimes he was, he was friends with Lurie. They went up and down. Like, John would say something totally insulting about him, and then they wouldn't hang out, But he hung around a bit, and we did a couple of, after John scored Strangers in Paradise.
Yeah.
Did a fantastic job, and also scored a couple of other Jarmusch films that came after that. You know,
he did Down by Law as well, right?
Down by Law. Yeah, I played on those scores, but I didn't do so much on. I did a lot on Mystery Train, which was also, I have to say, John Lurie is a fucking really interesting film composer. That Mystery Train score is great.
In the recording, you didn't write any of that music. That was all Lurie.
No.
Yeah.
No. I just was a side musician.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm going to use that word, side musician, because I know it's become, in this whole weird environment that we're in which people feel like the idea of a professional musician is like slightly suspect, and the term of side musician has become a term of contempt, and there's some mocking satirical song.
Yeah. Man,
the fucking best music of the last century was recorded using side musicians.
Yeah, man.
And I'm including Anarchy in the UK in that description. I'm including a whole lot of records that came out of Noise New York and other punk labels that the morons who are making those comments are unaware of who actually played on them.
Right.
I mean, there was a difference between the marketing of records and the making of them, and that's all I'm going to say.
Okay.
Because there's the myth of the big pink house and the commune that happens to play music is a beautiful myth, and it's a myth for a reason. It's a myth that answers to some very real lacks, very real discomforts and lacks in our lives because of the way things are currently economically organized.
Uh-huh.
But those situations are not going to be ameliorated by myth making. People who want to change that situation should make fewer myths and go to more organizing meetings. So I was a side musician on those Lurie sessions, and I am proud of my work as a side musician.
As you should be. And how many records did you make with the Lounge Lizards? Was it like 5 or 6 in that time?
The Lounge Lizards were not really a big recording band. So let me see. No Pain for Cakes, Big Heart Live in Tokyo, and Voice of Chunk. I think that those are the 3 that I recorded. And then, of course, I think the word is out, but years after I was in the Lounge Lizards, I don't think it's a total. I think the word is out that Marvin Pontiac was related to that crew.
Yeah. Did you play on that record, or is that a big secret?
Well, I don't think it's a secret anymore.
Okay, but you played on that.
It was pretty fucking funny, though, I have to admit.
Man.
Bring me rocks, bring me stones, so I can study them. Bring me rocks, bring me stones, so I can't study them.
One of my friends in Vancouver, Alex Vardy, he writes for the paper there, and when that record came out, he interviewed Lurie about something else, but he asked him a question about Marvin Pontiac, and I remember him telling me that Lurie just screamed and hung up the phone.
Although that might have revealed it fairly clearly.
I think so.
But anyway.
Yeah. Through your career, there's some really interesting kind of long-term relationships where you kind of duck in and out of people's lives, it seems like, and Lurie's one of them, I guess, and Zorn is another one. You've played on and off with Zorn. I guess you probably don't consider it on and off. You just sort of do projects when he calls or whatever.
Plus we have lunch fairly often.
You do? Okay.
Well, by the way, one thing that we need to not gloss over entirely is that when we referred to the Lounge Leaders and Lurie, we were talking about two people. Evan Lurie was composing quite a bit for the band, and is also an amazing film composer in his own right. And I played with Evan's work, in his tango band.
So, what was that called?
I don't remember what he called the band, but we did a very beautiful record called "Selling Water by the Side of the River," with the real deal. Argentinian bandoneon player, the late Pedro Perdonero.
There's a couple of records that I wanted to talk to you about. One of them is Saints, which was always one of my favorites of yours. And I wondered how you approached making a record like that, like how much of it is predetermined versus totally improvised. What makes you want to do a totally solo record, and how much do you prepare for something like that? Because it does sound somewhat planned out to me, but also there's like a huge spark of improvisation that runs through that whole record. So what drives you to do a solo record like that?
Guitar is a very solitary instrument, I mean, it's, a lot of other instruments, like if you play trumpet, then unless you want to play taps a lot, probably you're going to be in a band with some other people. But it's true that you can sit by guitar, play guitar alone, and I've been doing it since I've been 11.
Yeah.
And so sometimes you can think of that as practicing for other situations, but it's also just what it is. And I've always enjoyed playing alone. That's all I can say, really.
Uh-huh.
The band's always tight.
Did you just sit down and do that in a day or two, or was that like a long-term period that you just kept revisiting, or how did that album actually come to fruition? Because it's such a great sounding record.
Oh, okay, thanks. Well, that one, the way I do these, I have a really kind of tortured process of making albums. Like, usually what happens is I think that record came from a couple of different sources, a couple of different sessions. But usually what happens is I'll try to record a record. I'll try to record it at home.
Yeah.
Then I'm not quite happy with that. Then I'll try a studio. And then, sometimes it takes one or two shots to do the whole thing.
Right.
I lived with it for a while. With any record, including that one, I wound up taking from multiple sources, but the heart of the record always comes out in real time.
Right.
And I found this to be true with records of almost any type. You can spend a month working on a record, but the heart of the record is going to happen in one afternoon or two afternoons.
Yes, I totally agree. Yeah.
And then it's just a question of arranging the whole rest of it so that around the heart.
And in this case, where there's a solo guitar and there's no overdubs, as far as I'm remembering, it's all heart. There's nothing else being added to it later. So it is what it is, and it's it's very revealing and awesome thing. So,
well, thanks.
Another record I wanted to ask you about was the Cuban one, the Cubanos Postizos. Those, to me, like, they're kind of out of left field as far as like what you'd done before. They're kind of traditional in a sense, but kind of not at the same time. And I don't know, were you listening to a lot of Cuban music, and were you influenced by like Manuel Galban for guitar kind of stuff or anything like that? Because I hear some Los Zamphiros. I hear some of that kind of influence.
Well, I really dig Los Zamphiros.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're really great. But to be honest with you, I hadn't listened to them before recording the Cubanos Postizos thing. And what happened was, if there's a relation between my playing and Los Zamphiros, or between the Postizos and Los Zamphiros, it came about because we're both influenced by Arsenio Rodriguez, and we both come out of R&B.
Cubanita primorosa, juguetona y deliciosa. Cuando asome en la mañana tu sonrisa de La Habana, con su suave movimiento tan ligeros como el viento, que me excita y me fascina, que me lleve y me domina, bossa cubana, como noche luminosa.
So, there's a similarity because we both had similar influences.
That's crazy. So you'd actually never even heard that stuff before you made that record?
No.
Wow.
No, I never did. Ry Cooder hit me to Los Zamphiros, and I think he kind of hoped that I would, try to organize a project with them, but I just never got it together, to my regret. I think he was hoping I would kind of intervene in the same way as he had with Buena Vista Social Club.
Well, he made that record with Manuel Galban, too. That came after your record, that's for sure. Because yours was yours was a good 7 or 8 years before that one, I think. They're both very cool. But were you listening to other Cuban stuff at the time? Like, what was the?
Well, I had. If you live in New York, you get exposed to a fair amount of different kinds of Latin music, mostly salsa. So it was a part of the music that had been around me for a long time.
Yeah.
And I had, I guess I had, some Tito Puente records, a couple of different things that I listened to and dug, Eddie Palmieri, but didn't really know that much about. I was interested in it. A lot of my neighbors, when I used to live in Chelsea, and most of the other people in the building were, from Puerto Rico. And so I was interested. I heard a lot, and there would be music at the block parties and stuff. But I didn't have any expertise in it at all. But then, like around 1990, a lot of new Cuban, there started to be a lot of, when the Berlin Wall went down, there was, for some reason, a lot of really good Cuban stuff in East German record company archives.
Really?
And this started to become available when the wall came down, or for various reasons. I'm not 100% sure of what I just said, but for various reasons, there started to be a lot of reissues, and I started to dig them. And Anthony Coleman, who wound up playing keyboards in the Postillo said, "Hey man, you have to check out this guy Arsenio Rodriguez."
Yep.
You know, and I did, and I thought he was amazing, and I thought this was, you know, okay, that this was something I want to learn more about.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I've said this in other interviews before, but I didn't imagine that it was going to be hugely popular. I thought, okay, cool. I'll transcribe a couple tunes. We'll get a quiet little gig in some bar playing somewhere, and you know, that'll be fun. It'll be a project, one of many that I was involved in at the time. So I did. I transcribed the tunes.
Uh-huh.
We got together a band.
Yeah.
I knew from the beginning I didn't want to use horns. You
Okay.
know, like I wanted to translate it to rock band.
Right.
You know?
I got it. Yeah.
Both because I couldn't afford to use horns, and also because I think the process of translation is more interesting than the process of covering.
Don't cry.
I'm not that interested in trying to be original, but I'm very interested in the mistakes people make when they kind of sort of try to do something, you know, but across distance, across difference.
Mm-hmm.
So then on like the kind of, we tried a couple formats, quartet, and then we were doing a trio gig, and it was like our first gig we did in trio format, and we got signed to Atlantic. It was a benefit.
How? There was just somebody there that saw you and said, we got to record that?
Yep.
Cool. The cool thing about that record to me is, like, musically, obviously, it's inspired by that stuff. But also sonically, it kind of comes across in a similar kind of way as some of that vintage, the vintage Cuban stuff does, without trying to sound like you're copying it or anything. It's kind of got that roomy live sound that a lot of that stuff that was recorded, I guess, at Egram Studios in Havana did at the time. Was that something you guys were kind of going for? Like, was it a big...
Very much. I mean, I'm, you know, first of all, the producer, J.D. Foster, is super talented.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, you know, well, this is one of the... And I'm very aware of production values as being one of the elements in music, one of the most important elements.
Yeah.
In other words, you got the notes, you got the instruments, you got the people, and you got the production, and also you have the mics and the board and
the gear,
transistor, the gear, and a lot of the meaning of music is in the production value.
Right.
In fact, a lot of the meaning of Cuban music is in the production value.
Yeah, I think their sound is dictated a lot by the limitations that they had on them, because they were just in a government studio with certain, you know, space and time restrictions, and that's just the way that things sounded in there.
Yeah, but it's not only because of space and time, okay? But it's important. It's important to understand what this is. In other words, like by the time Buena Vista Social Club records became available in the mid-'90s, a lot of studios had switched to all digital formats, or were in the process of going over to digital, or were going, you know, from tube and transistor technology to digital technologies,
right?
You know, or from. And what was interesting, one of the contradictions about Cuban music was, I mean, one of the most famous Cuban independent films is called Memories of Underdevelopment. Mm-hmm. And it's very literal in the case of case of the recording gear, with the irony that in fact the tube and transistor equipment that was present in the studios in Havana actually sounds better.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
I'll take a Neve, I'll take those boards any day.
Sure.
Over an SSL board, you know.
Yeah, of course.
And I'll take either over a direct to Pro Tools sound with no that doesn't pass through any board.
Right.
And so it was this ironic thing of the old being kind of like of this old situation that had happened because of the limitations and poverty being identical to the, at the same time as this was happening, T-Bone Burnett and other top line producers in LA who were pursuing those sounds were paying top dollar to get old Neve boards to do the same thing. So It was one of those contradictions,
right,
as they say down there in Cuba.
So how did that inform your session that you did for that record? Like, did you?
Well, I sought out. Yeah, I sought out. I don't remember if we did it on a Neve board. But we did it on a similar board.
Yeah.
And JD was well aware, that we were not only, that we wanted to be aware of Cuban production values.
Yeah. Were you all set up in one room together?
Yes, we were, which doesn't mean that there were overdubs. There were, it was complex process getting that sound. I mean, I think there were, I had at least, he had it going through a cigar box amp in one room and my amp in another room, and I think he remiked it.
Yeah.
So he did a lot of work, JD, on getting that to sound that way, and it's really
there's obviously a lot of attention spent on the guitar sound, and it comes across, and it's amazing sounding.
No, it's good that you can hear that, because not many people can, and it's a huge, or not many people are aware of what they're hearing, and it's a huge part of it.
Right. Yeah, of course.
It's a pity, by the way, that given what's happened to the record industry now, the craft of producer is it's really been cut back.
Yeah, almost.
Very few people can afford producers.
Right, yeah.
Or enough studio time to work.
Right, in the proper way. So when you are involved in a session, like if you get a call from T-Bone or Joe Henry to do one of these albums that you do so regularly, just talking like kind of nerdy gear-wise here, how do you approach, like, if you're going out to LA to record for T-Bone, how do you know what to bring? Because you've probably got a pretty decent arsenal of stuff, and how do you approach a session with somebody like that that's going to be more of like an organic, rootsy kind of album?
Well, over the years with T-Bone and with Joe, first of all, both of those guys have guitar collections themselves that are fucking awesome.
Right.
In particular, T-Bone. I mean, you've got the vintage guitar collection of Doom, and
so you just pack a bag.
Well, no, actually, I bring a bunch of stuff. But what I do is I listen to the demos, make a call about where what direction it's going to go, and then I fill my guitar crypt with whatever I think T-Bone is less likely to have.
Okay. And what are some of your favorites? Like, what do you bring along a lot for those kind of records?
On the last session I did with T-Bone, I brought along my 1962 Jaguar.
Yeah.
Which is my main guitar if I actually need to play something.
Right.
Let me see, what else do we have there? I brought along my Telly, because for some reason T-Bone doesn't have.
Really?
Well, I think he's got something, but it's just not the specialty. It's not his specialty.
Yeah.
For some reason, I had my classical out there because Joe Henry wanted it on an earlier session.
Okay.
I always bring. I have a sitar.
You do?
I mean, an electric sitar.
Oh, like an old
Coral.
one, or a Dan?
An old Coral, yeah.
Oh, cool.
which is what was used on all those Motown things. And
Yeah.
I know that sounds pretty exotic, but man,
You get a lot of use out
that
of that.
thing winds up on a lot of
Yeah.
recordings.
Yeah.
She's all mine, and I'm so glad. She's the best woman that I ever had. She's all mine, and I'm so glad. She's all mine, and I'm so glad. She's all mine, and I'm so glad.
I have a national ukulele with a resonator on it.
Yeah, I've got one
That
of those.
comes in handy.
Yep. Yeah.
So, I like to have some kind of arch top at the session,
Yeah.
like starting with the Diana Krall record.
Mm-hmm. Which one?
I
The,
like
the T-Bone one?
Yeah, the one that T-Bone produced.
Yeah.
I like to mic the acoustic sound of an arch top that's also electric, and then leave the door open a crack so you're getting
Right.
some of the electric in that sound.
And say goodbye. The clock was striking 12 o'clock. It smiled on us below. With folded hands, it seemed to say, we're gonna miss you if you go. So I went back and kissed him, and when I looked around, the room was singing love songs and dancing up and down. And now
That's exactly what I kind of thought was. That's a real thing for you, and I would even guess that some of Saints was done that way too, right? Because it does definitely sound arch-toppy, but there's some crunch to it
Well,
too.
with Saints, there was actually a lot of isolation.
Okay.
But again, that was another J.D. Foster production. The effect of the mix, and this is important to to realize, is the effect of the mix is the intention of doing those things is to get a sound that's reminiscent of the guitar sound on like single mic technique
Yeah.
recordings of the 40s,
Yeah. Yeah.
and 40s, 30s, and early and 50s. You get a blend of the acoustic and electric properties of the instrument.
Yeah.
And again,
Jimmy
I
Reed
can't.
records are like that too.
Yeah, of course.
What about amps and stuff like that for you? Do you bring amps along when you go to sessions, or are there just enough of the cool amps kicking around that you don't have to worry about that kind of stuff?
Well, it's weird in LA. They tend to not have so many amps at the studio because people have cars. In New York, the studios usually have amps, although not necessarily the one I want.
Right.
I like to record with something with a 12-inch speaker, usually my deluxe reverb.
Throw it away. Did they know what it means? Someone's heartbreak, or did someone do somebody wrong? Well, the paint is all cracked. It was peeled off of the wood.
Is that's your go-to as your deluxe?
Yeah.
Do you use any weird 50s amps or anything like that? I've got a float-a-tone that I use a lot. I wondered if you had any weird, crunchy, old tube amps or anything like that.
I've gone through a bunch of amps, but I don't have anything right now that's particularly interesting. So
one other record I wanted to ask you about, Rain Dogs as well. I spoke with Stephen Hodges. He was telling me a bit about that session and how Tom Waits was involved in the drumming on that record and had some really strong conceptual stuff, and your guitar playing is very has a real sound on that record. Was that something that you had discussions with Tom about, or developed by experimentation, or was it just showing up and turning on and going for it?
more of the latter.
Really?
I mean, we had a rehearsal.
Yeah.
But the way Tom works is, if he digs something, then he leaves it alone, and if he doesn't, he tells you to try something else.
Yeah.
But Tom had come to hear me with Lounge Lizards, and so I figured that's what he wanted,
Right.
and so I did my best to do it.
playing in the studio with him differ from live in any way, or is it always just a matter of showing up and you kind of know what each other are going to bring to the party?
Well, I mean, studio playing is always different than live.
Yeah.
You can focus much more on the sonics,
Yeah.
But Tom's always been a great producer in the studio.
Yeah, that's what I hear. Yeah.
He has a great ear for what fits in and a very wide parameters for what fits in.
Right. Yeah.
He can make a lot of things fit in that other people wouldn't think would.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he said he said once, when I was trying to play something that sounded like something I'd played on an earlier record of his.
Yeah.
He says, once they know what it is, they stop listening.
That's some wise words right there.
Yeah.
Hitting a million in a drop-dead suit. Touch your pink on a downtown train. $2 pistol, but the gun won't shoot. I'm in the corner on the pouring rain. 16 men on a dead man's chest. And I've been drinking from a broken cup. 2 pairs of pants and a mobile vest. I'm full of bourbon, I can't.
Was that his way of telling you to not really try and recreate that, but just do something else that
Absolutely.
you were...
Absolutely.
And it worked.
It did that time.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about all this stuff, man. I'm a big fan of everything you do, and I've followed you for a long time, and I've seen you play a bunch of times. And
Okay, cool.
all right, man. Well, thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Take care. Bye. All right, well, that was a lot of fun. That was my conversation with Marc Ribot. I hope you enjoyed listening to it. It was sure cool talking to that guy and getting inside his brain a little bit. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I did bringing it to you, and also going through all his recordings and pulling that stuff up for you to listen to. It's always fun, but with him in particular, it's so crazy and like all over the place. So that was cool. Well, I'll be back next week with another episode of Music Makers and Soul Shakers. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and spread it around. Pass this along to your friends and compadres. And we'll see you next week on Music Makers and Soul Shakers.